very simple. Even if you don't feel like cleaning your bike, what you should do at least is lube your chain every once in a while. Just your block and So I'm just going to wipe the frame down really quick, or at least the chain down really quickly, just to give you an idea of how you want to lube. After you clean the bike, what you want to do is get rid of all water on the chain. What you can do is grab a rag and just basically run it to the gears again. It can be parked up against the wall. You don't need to stand to do it. Or you're basically just going to grab the chain with the rag, and you're going to hold it down. And just give it a wipe. Just get any water off the chain as quickly as possible. Again, if you were letting it sit outside in the sun, for example, this would already be done. It would already be dry. Even on like a basic level with cleaning, if you don't want to clean the frame or the wheels, what you do want to do is lube the chain every once in a while and take off any old grease off the chain.
Second, grab them.
So I'm going to grab one thing and I'll show you.
Oh, thank you.
I just had a coffee.
You can have this.
For the bike, not for you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
So apart from using the power washer, the degreaser, and all that to clean your bike, the very basic thing that you want to do to clean your bike, if you don't want to use the power washer, you don't want to use the garden hose, anything like that to clean your bike with the degreaser and the brush, what you can do, a very simple way, the most basic way to clean your drive chain is some sort of alcohol-based degreaser. This is brake cleaner for cars. It's alcohol-based. The reason you want to use alcohol-based is because there's no oil on it, and it will evaporate. Because we're going to be lubing the chain, what we don't want to do is mix oils together. The chain lube is an oil. WD-40, for example, is a water displacer that has oil in it. What you don't want to do is degrease your chain with WD-40 because that's just adding oil on oil, and that is a recipe for disaster. Because what's happening is the WD-40 oil that you put on before might be blocking the chain lube from getting to where it needs to go, and then your chain is just going to run on the WD-40 oil instead of the chain oil because it's just going to sit on the top, and it's going to be very inefficient and wear out your parts. So alcohol-based because it evaporates and it's not oil-based. So again, you can get this at Canadian Tire. We have, I think, some. Maybe we might be sold out right now. But anyway, just any alcohol-based. Grab a t-shirt rag or just old rag, anything like that you can find. Basically, going to spray it on the rag itself. You're going to grab the chain with the oil and you're going to run it backwards. You're basically getting gunk off the chain. It's a blue rag of black, it's not really showing you, but there's gunk there. And you're basically getting rid of any old oil that was built up on the chain. And that way it's going to allow you to put the new lube on, and the new lube is going to find its way into where it needs to go and allow you to have an efficient drive chain.
Is there a reason why you haven't sprayed it straight on?
Yes, because on that note, if you have disc brakes and you spray it straight on, there's going to be a possibility of the oil because it's an aerosol spray, to get onto the disc rotor, and because we're not washing the bike after, there's a possibility that once it's on the rotor, you use your brakes, you're going to have a contaminant on the brakes.
I spray directly. I stop the calipers.
Okay.
So on a rag is always safer. Again, if you're, like we were upstairs, if you're washing the bike after, there's not really a big risk with that because you're going to wash away any of the contaminants that were on the rotor anyway. But if we're just doing sort of what I call the dry clean, which is just with the degreaser and the rag and cleaning the drivetrain, then you want to put it on the rag directly instead of spraying it with an aerosol can. And we're going to take our lube. Most lube will have a little knob on it. There's two types of lubes. There's going to be a dry lube and a wet lube. The differences are pretty self-explanatory. A dry lube you're going to want to use in dry conditions. A wet lube you're going to want to use in wet conditions. The difference is a dry lube does not attract as much gunk as a wet lube, but will wash away in any wet weather. It's a light lubricant. So if you were to get if you were caught in a rainstorm, going through a creek crossing, anything like that where there's a substantial amount of water getting on the drivetrain, it's going to wash away this lube very quickly, and then you have no lube on your chain, and it's going to, again, be a problem. The chain's going to make lots of noises and things like that. A wet lube will not wash away. It's got a thicker viscosity, but it will attract a lot more gunk. So if you're using a wet lube in dry conditions, you're basically just piling gunk on gunk on gunk. You only really want to use a wet lube in wet conditions. So what I recommend wet lubes for is your mountain biking, you're commuting, or you're riding in the winter. A recommend a wet lube because you don't know what kind of conditions you're going to encounter. I recommend a dry lube for dry conditions, road riding. If you're in a dry climate, for example, so like Arizona, use a dry lube because it's not going to rain there, and you will put, and obviously there's a lot of dust and things like that, so the dust will just build up on the chain if it was a wet lube. So in this scenario, we're going to use a dry lube. We're in the summertime, most likely riding on the road, so no issues there. We're just going to use the dry. How are you going to put the lube on? It's a drip bottle here. So all you're going to do is, again, the bike doesn't have to be on the stand, it can be on the wall. You're basically going to coat the chain while running it through. And your goal is to coat every single link with a drop of lube. So I just did it really quickly by running it through, making sure that every link was covered. If you were really anal about it, you could drip one lube on each link. That's going to take forever. So you can just do the method of spinning it backwards and then going on each lube. And then what you can do as well, you can spin it backwards a little bit more, and that's going to make sure that the oil is going to circulate around the chain and cover every link that you need to cover. So once that's done, what you're going to want to do is you're going to let it sit for about 5 minutes. Let the chain lube work its way into where it needs to work into. Basically, the chain lube needs to work into the pins and rivets of the chain. So each chain has a little roller on each link. That's what physically goes over the cogs and allows the chain to bend over those cogs. That's the area that the lube needs to work its way into for the chain to be very efficient to roll around the cog, right? Once you've let it sit for about 5 minutes, what you're going to want to do is take your rag. And another reason why we use alcohol degreaser is because it evaporates. So now our rag has no degreaser on it anymore, just some grease areas. So we're going to find a clean side of the rag. We're going to wipe off any excess. So it's found its way into where it needs to go. There's no reason for any lube on the top to still be around because we don't need it, and all it's going to do is just attract more gunk. So you're just going to wipe off any excess. And that's it. And you just give it a couple turns, let it find its way around, and then you have lubricated your chain. This whole process takes 2 minutes. If you're, other than the waiting time, takes 2 minutes of actual time to lubricate. And that's that.
So you don't have to lubricate the gears?
Nothing like that, because the chain itself is going to lubricate those parts for you as it rolls around. And the only real thing that you need to lubricate is the chain, because it is metal on metal, but the parts that you want to lubricate are the pins and rollers, because those are the parts that are moving. These don't need to be lubricated. If you lubricate these, all it's going to do is just attract more gunk, cause your drive chain to be really dirty. You can get a different kind of lubricant or use the chain lube to lube areas that move, for example, but this is like more advanced maintenance. So for example, pulley wheels, things like this, they're wheels that move. You can see like that. If you wanted to, you could add like a little drip of lube to those areas there.
How about the front derailleur?
So this bike doesn't have a front derailleur, but you can do it like that. When we do services on bikes, we lube what's called pivot points. So pivot points are areas where things will move from. So the derailleur has pivot points. You can see here, this is a pivot point. As the derailleur itself, when it moves, it shifts off of that point there, right? So you can lubricate that area there if you wanted to. It's not really necessary, but maybe every once in a while you want to do it. After maybe a clean, like if you're using a power washer, you may want to do it as well. If there was a front derailleur, the front derailleur would have pivot points as well. There's areas on the bike that allow the derailleurs to move. So there's a pivot point here, there's pivot points here, there's a pivot point here because this moved, the touch was on, like that. So anything that looks like it would allow something to move is a pivot point. Obviously, you don't want to put any oil, if you have disc brakes, anywhere near the rotor or the caliper, because it's going to get contaminated, make loud squeaking noises, and at that point you have to replace the pads, and worst case scenario, also replace the rotor as well, depending on how contaminated it is. That's it. Any questions? We're all okay? Very simple stuff. If you do this every little bit, it's going to help a lot with keeping the life of your bike alive, right? What I would recommend in terms of changing things is bring it to a mechanic once a season to just check again, like those bearings, those chains, things like that. Chains will wear out. Chains wear as you shift. So the more you shift, the more play actually develops in the pins and rivets of the chain. Right here, the play will develop side to side of the chain. If it's really worn out, it's just not going to shift properly because shifting up is dependent on how stiff the chain is, right? So if the chain is really loose because there's lots of play built in side to side with this chain, it's going to struggle getting into those next gears. Another thing that's going to do, it's also going to wear out the metal bits on your cogs. If a chain is really worn out, it'll wear these teeth out completely, and then you have to replace it both. So when you replace a chain, if the previous chain was completely worn out, it had worn the cassette out, the new chain won't mesh with the links, and it's just going to sit on the top and actually skip under load. So if you replace your chain before it wears out, you actually don't have to replace your cassette. So it saves you money in the long run.
How often to change?
I would say check it at least maybe twice a season. So either bring it into a mechanic, or there are tools called chain checkers here. And what a chain checker will do is basically push on the chain and basically measure the wear. So on this one, there's a little window here, and it basically says this chain's about like 60% worn, right? So it's not really like a mathematical like equation, or like it's like, you know, 60% on one chain might be a little bit different than another. It depends on the manufacturer. But what you don't want to see is this chain checker go like that, because that means it's completely worn out and you have a problem with the drive chain. But I would say either once a season is a good call to change a chain, depending on how much you ride. There is not really a set number. It's not like cars where it's like, okay, you got to change your timing belt at 20,000 K or something like that. Maybe not 20,000, but it's things like that, right? It's not going to say, yeah, change your chain at 1,000 kilometers, because it really depends on a lot of factors, conditions you ride in, how many times you shift, that sort of thing. There's no real way to track that. What I would say is bring it in on your bike once a season to get the drive chain checked, or at least do a tune-up on the bike. Every time we check a bike in, we check it with a chain checker. If your drive chain is close to being worn out, or your chain is close to being worn out, we'll be like, hey, change your chain. It'll save you money in the long run, that sort of thing. Because a chain only costs, depending on, like this chain, for example, for this bike is going to cost $50. This cassette is going to cost $120. So you imagine you wear your chain out, you have to change the chain, which is $50, and the cassette, which is $120. If you change your chain before it went out, you only have to spend the $50. You can get a life out of the cassette. You can get 4 or 5 chains on one cassette if you replace them before they wear out. So it does save you a little bit of money in the long run.
So that's my own experience. That did happen. And the chain starts to wear out. Where's
It will also wear the cog on the front. Now again, because this is a larger cog, it distributes load a bit more evenly than the smaller cogs here. So about 99% of the time, this is never really worn out. If the chain wears out. But in those scenarios where you rode the crap out of your bike and the chain wore out and you continue to ride it and it wore out the cog, then yes, you will also have to replace the cog in the front as well.
I had to replace the back cog and the chain. Because I was going uphill and the chain just cracked.
That's another thing as well. If the chain is really, really, really worn out, because there's so much play built into those pins and rivets, if you do a power shift, so let's say you shift under load, climbing out of the saddle, things like that, that chain is susceptible to breaking because it's a lot weaker to take those lateral motions than a newer chain, which is stiff. So there is an argument to be made that we should change your chain for safety reasons as well, because it could break under load. It's a very rare occurrence, but it can happen.
For manual Shimano gears, do they have to be like cleaned or washed or?
No, they're sealed. So I wouldn't do anything there. If you're gonna let it, the problem with those Shimano, like you're talking trigger shifters right now. So trigger shifters, if you let sit, what we found with trigger shifters, if you let them sit for like 10 years in a garage, what tends to happen is all of a sudden they accumulate a lot of dust inside of there, and they just stop working. So the only thing you can do is take your bike out and start shifting it, and then the dust will come out and you're good. If you're going to store a bike for 10 plus years, it's going to be a problem. But that's a very niche. We get a lot of old bikes that come in, for example, with trigger shifters. Most of the time they have to be replaced because they've accumulated that dust, and now the mechanism inside no longer works.
There's
But
another
that's it.
option, right? You can just buy a new bike.
That is another option. Again,
That's for your guys.
If you don't want to do any of this, buying a new bike will solve all your problems.
Where's Aaron? He's gonna break
You
it.
can sleep in the garage. Very good.
Okay?
Thank you.
We gotta get to it.
Thank you.